the heading, God's Love for Israel. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more I called Israel, the further they went from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms. But they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. I lifted the yoke from their neck and bent down to feed them. Will they not return to Egypt? And will not Assyria rule over them because they refuse to repent? Swords will flash in their cities, will destroy the bars of their gates and put an end to their plans. My people are determined to turn from me. Even if they call to the Most High, he will by no means exalt them. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I turn and devastate Ephraim. For I am God and not man, the Holy One among you. I will not come in wrath. They will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt, like doves from Assyria. I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. So, I was reading Calvin and Hobbes this past week, or what I like to call sermon prep. And there's this great blog series from a few years ago, and it's entitled The Theology of Calvin and Hobbes, and needless to say, I quite enjoy it. And I'll give you just a snippet of it, but I have to warn you, those that are sitting in the back, that every once in a while, passively, aggressively, I encourage you to sit further towards the front. And so when you cannot read these, this is me being passive-aggressive, encouraging you to sit towards the front. So I'll read through this with you. This is Hobbes in front of the cigarette machine. Look, it says you have to be 18 to buy cigarettes. Calvin, 18? By then I'll know better. Calvin to his mom, Mom, can I have a cigarette? Sure, Calvin, I think your grandfather left some here. Just smoke outside, okay? Wow. Hobbes, your mom let you have a cigarette? Calvin, for a mom, sometimes she's pretty cool. And then the last one, he's taking a deep puff on the cigarette. And then, blah, cough, hack. Hobbes, sideline, muses, you'd think this would be an easy habit to break. Mom, well, now, did you learn a little lesson today? Calvin gasped, yes. And then, alone with Hobbes, trusting parents can be hazardous to your health. Now, I do that because I like Calvin and Hobbes, but I also like that connection of trusting parents can be hazardous to your health. We want to make that connection to God as a loving parent. Is trusting this parent hazardous to our health? Shifting gears a little bit, there are a few issues amongst North American Christians that can be more deeply divisive than the final fate of God's Jewish people. All sorts of thoughts and opinions about this. Will God save en masse all the Jews? And will they get to experience peace in God's new creation? Or will the Holy Spirit convert some Jews to the Christian faith before Christ returns? Or will God finally grant all Jewish people salvation through a faithful relationship with Jesus Christ? And there are, of course, questions. These are questions, of course, that our passage, Hosea 11, doesn't kind of explicitly address. Right? Hosea 11 focuses instead specifically on 8th century Israel, 8th century BC Israel, and its relationship to the Lord. Now, the scriptures, though, still kind of indirectly sometimes start to address universal questions by dealing with specific people and specific circumstances. So earlier in the prophecy, of course, I alluded to this earlier, Hosea describes Israel as God's wife, right? And the prophet is describing his own kind of young marriage to the adulterous Gomer. But our text here, once we get to chapter 11, our text speaks of the Lord as Israel's loving parent. Now, if you scan the scriptures, of course, more often than not, the Bible generally refers to God as Father, right? Yet we know that God is neither male nor female in the way that we usually think of those terms. God has, the Bible describes in a number of ways, has loving attributes of both a father and a mother, right? And in some ways, isn't that kind of providential, right? I mean, after all, God is the perfect father. Now, some parents have scarred their children. So if we thought of God only as father, for instance, some of us might have a hard time trusting that kind of a father figure. And maybe there's some reason that we can be thankful that the Bible also uses some feminine imagery to describe the Lord. The scriptures never explicitly refer to God as our heavenly mother, yet they seem to describe God in a number of ways with motherly characteristics. So you go to Psalm 131, for example, and it compares God to a mother who soothes her baby. Or a number of times in the New Testament, you can look and see how it compares God to a woman who searches for a lost coin. Hosea here understands himself about being a dad. Right? He's after all, we've seen this already, he's raised 3 children, and he quite possibly did this as a single parent with not a lot of support from his wife. So maybe the prophet isn't surprising us all that much when, as he thinks about God's relationship with Israel, he emphasizes just how much God has done for his child that is Israel. And so in our passage, I statements, right? I statements dominate the description of God's history with Israel in those first 4 verses of chapter 11. They describe actions that are largely performed by parents. And when we get to verse 9, God insists that God is God, not man. And most of our text, however, emphasizes the way God stoops to our level. And so based on this, James Mays talks about comparing how God is like a parent who bends down to pick up and then just cuddle a baby. And so we profess that God has only one natural child, right? The son we know as Jesus Christ. And then Israel in this imagery is God's adopted child. And I think that's important imagery as we see this passage, right? So Jesus is God's natural son, but Israel is his adopted child. And that means that God didn't just free Israel from Egyptian slavery. God also somehow at the same time adopted her into God's family. Now, some modern adoptive parents can learn virtually everything there is to know about the child that they're adopting. Well, God knows everything about Israel. Yet, God graciously sets God's love on, and he chooses Israel to be God's child in spite of everything that he already knows about her. This is an important preamble as we kind of start to think about God's people who are rebellious children. Now, a teenage girl brought her new boyfriend home to meet her parents. And they were just appalled by his appearance, right? He's wearing a leather jacket, some motorcycle boots, he's got tattoos, a pierced nose, and maybe a couple of nipples, right? This is kind of startling for the parents, right? The parents pull the daughter aside, and they say, we're kind of concerned, right? The mother says kind of diplomatically, dear, he doesn't seem to look all that nice, right? And the daughter replies, oh, please, Mom, right? If he wasn't nice, why would he be doing 500 hours of community service? Sometimes we're rebellious children. We are, right? In some ways, Israel and you and me, we're a bit like a child in the orphanage who has particular needs whom nobody wants to adopt. Yet we know that bringing any child into the world and raising them always entails some sort of risk. There's always a risk there. Parents wonder how children they adopt and children who are naturally born to them, they wonder how they're going to turn out. And right after all, most loving parents, most of the time, even loving parents can have very rebellious children. And so we shouldn't be surprised that our loving God adopts Israel and that Israel turns out to be so radically different from Jesus' natural son, Jesus Christ. And if we're honest, I think we sometimes, when we think about these things, about any rebellious child, we think and we want to at least silently, maybe not overtly, blame parents for their children's rebellion, right? I mean, don't we all, after all, kind of speculate a little bit, at least in our own minds? Well, the rebellious boy's daddy was just too demanding. Or that troubled woman's mother, she's just kind of overbearing. Right? Now, certainly sometimes parents' negative flaws, right, sometimes impact our children. Right? Any physical and mental and spiritual health that our children enjoy is nothing then less than a miraculous gift of God in many ways. But Israel's kind of plight reminds us that even the most perfect parent sometimes has rebellious children. I mean, after all, while Jesus is God's faithful son, who doesn't count equality with God something to be grasped, in the garden, we also have Adam and Eve, who are God's rebellious children, who try to make themselves like God. But Jesus doesn't rebel against God. Even when Satan ruthlessly tempts him in the desert, in her own wilderness, Israel stubbornly rebels against the Lord. In fact, says Hosea, the more God called to Israel, the farther she, like a rambunctious toddler, would run away from the Lord. So Jesus is the faithful son who submits to the Father's will, even though it costs him his life on the cross. Israel is the rebellious son who relentlessly resists God's will. And God called Israel, the adopted son, to bring God's salvation to the world. So he calls this son, this child, this adoptive child, Israel, and their role was to bring this salvation to the world, but they don't do it. So God has to send his natural son, Jesus, into the world to fulfill the mission which Israel was supposed to do, which they failed to do. And so as a result, in Hosea 11, verse 5, God warns some Israelites will have to flee before the advancing Assyrians. They'll literally have to return to where? Return to Egypt. Now, we know that Egypt, right, is certainly a physical place, but it's also a biblical symbol for exile and slavery. And so God warned that the Assyrians would soon cart many, if not most, of God's rebellious children back into exile or into exile. And so even as we kind of see this whole scene, the question for us maybe isn't if we will rebel against the Lord, but how do we rebel against the Lord? Because we all rebel. Right? Adam and Eve, they're given paradise, but they thought they knew better than God. And so they chose to do what God told them not to do. And in many ways, we are like Adam and Eve. Proverbs 20, verse 9, we all rebel against God and choose to do our own thing. No one can say, I'm innocent. I've never done anything wrong. Pastor Rick Warren talks about a rebellion against God, and it falls into three categories in his description. I think they're helpful. They've been helpful to me. And so the first one is straight up sin. And sin is really kind of an archery term, right? That means missing the mark or falling short, right? So Romans 3, all